You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, and I was shocked that I got to talk to him the first time because I've been such an admirer of his as he goes on TV and obliterates people. But he's coming on again, and it's Jonathan Turley. He's a law professor. He has held the Shapiro Chair for Public Interest Law at George Washington University Law School since 1998. We just had him on. It's been a few months, I think, for The Indispensable Right, a book. Today, he's coming on to discuss his new book, which I devoured in just a few days because it's just so well written. It is just so provoking. Exactly what you want. The book is titled Rage and the Republic, The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution. Professor Turley, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Robert, it's great to be with you again.
Well, you're very kind, not only to write these books, but to give us an hour to try to talk through them. We like subtitles here at the Leaders and Legends podcast. Why is your subtitle The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution?
Well, the book was an effort on our 250th anniversary to look at what were the unique combinations of personalities and events that led to this creation of the world's oldest and most stable democracy. And to do that, I looked at both the American and French revolutions, often through the sort of eyes of Thomas Paine, who is one of only two individuals who played a significant role in both revolutions, the other being Lafayette. And in examining those two revolutions, the question that I raise is why one it became this successful democratic model, and the other became the reign of terror. And it looks at a sort of tale of two cities, of Philadelphia and Paris, both experiencing violence after the American Revolution. But one stabilized and the other blew apart. And the point of the second half of the book is that we need to consider what were those unique elements, because the challenges we're facing in the 21st century are going to require us to lean very heavily upon those very same elements if we are to survive and to thrive. So the American Republic is still an unfinished work. That's what Benjamin Franklin was referencing when he said it's a republic if you can keep it. Every generation has to keep it. But this generation is facing unprecedented challenges. And the book goes into the economic impact of robotics and AI, the effect of global governance through systems like the EU, and the rise of what I call the new Jacobins, a reference to those radicals who brought about the terror in the French Revolution. Back then, the Jacobins were not the proletariat. They were professors, journalists, lawyers, politicians. And they initially spoke of due process and the rights of man, and then they became the architects of one of the most blood-soaked tyrannies in history.
So because in some ways we had, by that I mean the Americans of the Revolutionary period, as opposed to the French of its Revolutionary period. So much of what we as Americans and the founders brought to the discussion, to their writings, to their arguments, were, and you talk about this a lot in your book, were the writings and ideas and arguments of philosophers of Europe, French philosophers including. How did the Americans figure this out in a way that the Europeans, and in some cases Frenchmen, didn't really figure out. And by figure out, I mean you can have a government without the guillotine.
Well, it is an excellent question because the American Revolution, as I talk about in Rage and the Republic, was the first Enlightenment revolution in history. And because of that, we were a fascination with people in Europe. Remember, these Enlightenment writers had written decades earlier, but it was the combination of events in the United States that brought about these critical figures at a critical time to become the first Enlightenment revolution. And the Europeans were fascinated by us. I talk about in the book how there was a French writer of some note who came to the United States and wrote under the name Farmer John. And he wrote a book that was the rage in Europe. And the line that always struck me as the most profound in that book was when he asks, "What then is this American?" Many Europeans viewed Americans as an almost mythological group of humans, a new species. Keep in mind, we were so new on every level in terms of the concepts of government. We were not united by land, history, religion, even culture. We had a legacy of ideas. We were based on the Enlightenment principles that there are certain inalienable rights that are given to us not by the government but by God. And that was an amazing moment for many who had only read this in the abstract, in Locke and Montesquieu and other writers. So we brought together the right people at the right time. I spent a lot of time talking about Thomas Paine, who may have been the most fascinating historical figure I've ever researched, and I spent years digging into his life. But Paine was the righteous rage of the American Revolution. He was arguably the most revolutionary of the American Revolution. And he knew what it would take to bring a people to revolution. It was James Madison who knew what it would take to bring a revolution into a republic. And he was the pious logic to that righteous rage. And the combination of those types of voices created something new. And, it's interesting because Paine never signed on with Madison on what were called the auxiliary precautions, those limitations on democratic will. The framers did not want Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy, despite all of its glorified writings, was an utter failure. It did not last that long and resulted in tyranny. The framers didn't want that. They didn't want what they called a mobocracy. They wanted to guarantee liberty because the Declaration of Independence doesn't use the term democracy. It talks about liberty. It's an Enlightenment document. And to achieve true liberty, you have to limit impulse and deter what's called the tyranny of the majority. Paine didn't like all of those precautions. And when he went to France, he joined with Jacobins in trying to create more direct democracy, to allow the people to speak and to achieve goals very quickly. That view of Paine came damn near to killing him. He came within 24 hours of being guillotined as he sat in the Luxembourg prison. And so Paine came to realize that Madison was right, that you have to have a republic that protects minority interests and protects against what they called democratic despotism.
Let me stop you right there because that you hit on some of my notes, and that is the democratic despotism. How would you define that? And could you give an example or two, modern day or during this period, or other countries actually, where democratic despotism took hold to the detriment of a country and its people?
Well, the framers, particularly Madison, were great students of history. And what they saw in history was that these revolutions devoured themselves. That there was a Frenchman who famously said after the French Revolution that revolutions like Saturn devour their own. And they watched that happen. All of those Jacobins, not all of them, but most of the leading Jacobins were themselves executed, including people like Robespierre. And so it did devour them. And that's precisely what the framers of our country tried to avoid. Napoleon Bonaparte was brought to power by the failure of the French Revolution. So much like Athens, they turned to a single tyrant. And Bonaparte famously said a revolution is an idea that has found its bayonets. Well, the fact is that it's a lot easier to start a revolution than it is to end one. And so that's what's unique about the American Republic. So when we talk about democratic despotism, we're talking about the majority stripping away protections of the minority, imposing its will. The French Revolution was the ultimate example of democratic despotism. Many people view the French Revolution, at least some scholars view the French Revolution, as a Rousseauian revolution, because it was the philosopher Rousseau who wrote beautifully about unleashing the general will of the people. And Rousseau was extremely naive and believed, as did Paine, that if people were given a true voice, they would lead us to a sort of perfect society, that the will of the people would advance humanity. Of course, that's not what happened. That if you strip away precautions and allow the majority to dictate all conditions, it becomes its own form of despotism.
One of my favorite passages, and I'm reading it here from your book, and I think it's you more quoting someone, and that's Hannah Arendt.
Yes.
She wrote that the tragic irony is that the French Revolution had a greater impact than the American Revolution on later revolutions. Now, I just finished reading a book on the death of Trotsky. Terrific book. And I was struck by that passage because it sure does seem that that's the case. And I remember when Mikhail Gorbachev went to the UN. I don't know if you remember this. You may be a year or two older than me, per se. But do you remember when he went to the UN and he praised the French and the Russian revolutions and he left out the American Revolution? Do you remember that?
Yes, well, first of all, Erin was a wonderful scholar, and I actually quote her a couple times in this book because this
Right.
book is really a book about revolutions. And she was the other academic that spent a lot of time on that subject. And there were others, but I think she, without question, was the most brilliant. And I certainly agree with many of the things that she said. Her statement about the American Revolution is in many ways glaring and grating for many Americans. But what she meant, she believed deeply in the American Revolution. But what she meant was that there's an irony here. The American Revolution produced the most successful democracy in the world, but it was not influential on later revolutions. The French Revolution, when it started, they loved the American Revolution. They gave citizenship to Thomas Paine, James Madison, George Washington. And as soon as Paine got there, he fell out of favor, which is hit the story of his life. He was charged with sedition in all three nations that claimed him as a citizen,
I
and
don't
that's
know
what
why I find that funny.
yeah,
Sorry,
well, I just
Professor.
love that about Paine. Yeah, and but the interesting thing is that the French Revolution, of course, was an utter failure, but it was not a failure in the eyes of early communists. They looked at, and there was early French communists that came out of the French Revolution that were ultimately crushed by the remaining sort of former Jacobins who had had enough of all this. But to people like Lenin and others, those radicals really were great because they showed how you could use terror, how you could use state devices and power to take control of the government. And so, what most of us look at with horror was viewed by people like Lenin as a roadmap.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Professor Jonathan Turley. We are discussing his new book, Rage and the Republic. the unfinished story of the American Revolution. How would you, for the purposes of this book or perhaps your class, how would you define rage?
Well, it's this is my second book that touches on rage, and you were kind enough to have me on my first book, Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. And rage is a fascinating topic because most nations are born in revolution. We were one of the many that are the product of revolution, and that makes us the product of rage. You don't get the revolution unless you are enraged. And that was the key to Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote in this penetrating style, but he captured the rage of his generation. And what makes him most remarkable in that sense is Thomas Paine arrived on these shores only 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. And he was an utter failure. He had been fired from every job he held. His marriages had collapsed. He was detested, penniless. He appeared in front of a man in London, unkempt, penniless, combative, alone. But that person saw something in that pile of human wreckage that seemed brilliant. And his name was, of course, Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin sent Paine to the United States to write. And within 2 years, he would be called the penman of the revolution. He gave voice to that rage. But of course, rage, like revolution, is something that devours its own. That rage gives you a license to do things that you would not ordinarily do. It can give you a license to kill. And what people who experience rage don't admit, and I think you can see this in the streets around the country during some protests, is that they like it and they need it. Rage can be addictive. Once it's released, it's very hard to break that addiction. That's what we saw in France. That is, the rage that was released just became this tsunami that swept over the whole country, which went into this murderous fit of some of the most unspeakable crimes against anyone who was viewed as questioning the revolution. And that, of course, is the challenge that Rage in the Republic really discusses, is how to keep your country from being torn apart by those very passions. We are a very unique country in that sense. We sort of found the secret sauce. But one of the things that Rage and Republic addresses, particularly in the second half of the book, is how we can survive the coming century. With all of with what's coming down this mountain is a world of hurt. We're looking at economic changes that are breathtaking. And I'm talking about the combination of robotics and AI. And it is going to be a challenge for systems to survive. I was talking about this book in Prague recently, and one of the EU members raised in the audience, you talk about how the United States can survive and flourish in the 21st century in this book, but you seem to be less optimistic about us. And I said, I I am less optimistic about the EU. I would bet against the EU because the EU has destroyed the very things this book talks about that you will need to survive this century.
Is it fair to say that a mob is it's certainly contagious? That's for sure. And we've seen that whether it's civil rights marches or British soccer insanity, which is what we Americans love to point to. We love to pick on British soccer fans. But is it also morally neutral? I mean, is it rage as a mob? Is rage something that can be used for the benefit of a country or society? We just aren't really seeing it that much lately.
It can be. That's the reason rage can be righteous. When George Washington was on the ropes at Valley Forge, when his army was falling apart, he encountered Payne on the road, and he was just a rifleman in a militia. And he immediately pulled him aside and said, "We need you to write again. That I don't need another rifleman. I need Thomas Paine." And Paine went and wrote The American Crisis. And that was perhaps the most rageful publication of his many bestsellers. He called the country to account, and he did capture that rage. But the question then is, how do you put it away? And the book, in this sort of Tale of Two Cities, looks at Philadelphia after the Revolution. There was violence building in the streets again, and cannon were brought out. People were killed. There was an attack on the home of James Wilson, and I talk about this attack called the Battle of Fort Wilson, and Fort Wilson was just Wilson's home. But Wilson was almost killed. Others died. And Philadelphia was heading down the same path as Paris, and then it stopped. It didn't stop entirely. Obviously, we went on and had problems like the Whiskey Rebellion, et cetera, and all of these other conflicts, but it largely stopped in our cities. And even though the Constitution was unpopular by many in Pennsylvania, that seemed to be the thing that made the difference, that once it was ratified, people seemed to realize that they had an alternative. They did not have to go into the streets to achieve their interests and to try to change conditions around them. And so suddenly we emerged from that intact as a nation. France never had that, so they never had a constitution of that kind. Paine did try to get them to adopt a constitution that was like the American Constitution, and it was more moderate than the so-called Mountain Wanted. That's the group of Jacobins represented by Robespierre and people like Marat. And that's when he became unpopular. They were shocked, their hero, Thomas Paine, was even arguing that they should spare the life of the king and queen. And so suddenly Paine found himself again persona non grata. There's nothing more inconvenient than a revolutionary after a revolution. And Paine discovered that. I talk in the book how Benjamin Franklin's daughter said it would have been better for Thomas Paine to die after common sense. And what I note in the book is she was one of his friends. I mean, so this was actually coming from someone who liked him. And that's what makes Paine so fascinating.
One of the other books I've read recently for a podcast, and I'm going to guess either you've read the book, are familiar with the book, or its author, and the author is Professor Edward Larson. And he just wrote a book declaring independence, Why 1776 Matters. And in some ways, it was a perfect book to read before your book, Rage in the Republic, because he too spends a lot of time on Paine and Paine's influence. Why don't we know more about Thomas Paine? Why isn't he glorified in statues and such, especially on the eastern seaboard of the United States? I mean, he was the person who put thought into words in a way that not only Washington and Jefferson and Adams and Franklin could understand it, but so could have his former fellow militia and soldiers.
That's absolutely true. When Common Sense was first published, it was anonymous, and there was great speculation at who had written it. And John Adams' wife asked him and wrote him a letter saying, "People are saying you're the author." And John Adams wrote back and said, "I couldn't have written Common Sense, but I think I know who did." He'd only met Thomas Paine once. And he said, "There's a man named Thomas Paine." And he describes a first meeting with Thomas Paine where one of his friends said, "There's this individual who has genius in his eyes." And it was an interesting letter because John Adams didn't like Paine. He was a bit, in my view, sort of jealous of Paine because Paine became this towering figure in 2 years. He was sort of a Johnny-come-lately in the view of John Adams. But there was another reason, and that is Paine wasn't like any of them, right? They preferred people like Thomas Jefferson, tall and handsome and erudite, and a slave owner. Paine was against slavery. Now, clearly John Adams was as well, but Thomas Jefferson was much, much more in the model of the American intellectual and sort of Renaissance man. Thomas Paine was someone who had fights with everyone who tried to get close to him. He was contrarian. It's what I really value about him. He's the most contrarian individual I have ever researched. And in the book, I actually mentioned that I'm a film noir nut, and I drive my kids crazy because I do nothing but watch black and white film noir when I work. I have to have something in the background. And, but my favorite line in any film noir was delivered by Fred Murray, who has spent the night with the ultimate femme fatale, a married woman who had lied to every man in her life. And she had promised that she had finally broken up and would stay with Fred Murray. And then in the morning, he realizes she had lied to him again and that she's incapable of telling the truth. And so he walks to the door to leave her, and he stops at the door and turns around and delivers the single best line in the history of film noir. He says, "I love you so much, I only wish I liked you." And that's sort of the way I feel about Paine. I love him so much, I only wish I liked him. He's a cantankerous figure, and he tended to push away people. And what I say in the book is what's strange about Paine is he had this genius about humanity, but he was perfectly clueless about humans.
What's the difference?
He had a hard time working individually with other people. In many ways, I think he was misunderstood. He was so contrarian, he did not yield. He stuck with his convictions. But also, he was penniless, but for a good reason, in my view. He kept the prices of his bestsellers. I mean, Common Sense was the first world bestseller. He kept the price low so everyone could read it. And he gave what little money he got from it to soldiers of the revolution. So he was an extremely generous person in that sense. But he would grate on people because he had this problem in interpersonal relationships. And one of the best moments I describe in the book is when virtually everyone is now being rounded up in the French Revolution. So all of the earlier revolutionaries have been executed, or they're in Luxembourg about to be executed. People like Danton and others were on their way. And Paine retreats to an inn with the few remaining friends. And one by one, they're taken from the inn to be executed over weeks, leaving him alone. They even take the innkeeper, and he's there alone. And they finally come for him. And he asks, "What am I charged with?" And the gendarme sort of shrugged because it didn't matter what you were charged with.
That's right.
And so Paine had finally seen that a mobocracy had been created. And he finally saw the logic of James Madison, of why you have to control democratic will.
Would you have signed Louis XVI death warrant?
No, no. Paine was right about that. He actually earned the ire of
That's right.
of the mountain when he stood up and said, "Why don't you banish him to America? And the Americans will watch him for you instead of spilling their blood, both the king and the queen." I but that only put his name on the list. When he gave that speech, people were very upset with Paine that he would ever speak such words. And the Girondins, who was the Jacobins, who were sort of the faction opposed to the mountain, they were all rounded up and executed for the most part. But no, I wouldn't have signed off on it. What Paine and Lafayette wanted was a sort of figurehead king, and that was a huge change for Paine because the one sort of burning principle of his life is a deep hatred for aristocracy. So it took a lot, but when he saw what was happening in France, he decided that they should have a constitutional monarchy. Now, I don't think I would have signed off necessarily on a constitutional monarchy. I can see why he wanted it, but I wouldn't have executed the king.
It's part of the reason this was kind of my thought as I was reading your book, is that, let's take the Stamp Act, I think, is that 1765,
Mhm.
right around there. So let's just say that the Americans are fat and happy until 1765. They're still fat, but they become less happy. And you have from that time period to the first shots in April of 1775, let's say you have 10 years. Whereas the Americans had basically a period of 10 years plus to get all riled up. But the French had centuries and centuries of pent up anger as they had been starved in some cases, sent off to fight in ridiculous wars just for Louis XIV and other kings' personal glory. Did that have anything to do with it? Just the culture, the society that it had been repressed for hundreds of years, and this was their chance, and they weren't going to pass up any opportunity to be rageful?
I think that just as the United States had an incredible combination of geniuses at the right moment, that was lacking in the French Revolution. It's not that they didn't have geniuses, they didn't have the right ones. And you did not have a James Madison in France. There were some people that held James Madison's same views, people that actually argued for many of these precautions. But ultimately, you did not have those voices predominate because we had, the Constitutional Convention, which was not pure democracy, right? That was a group of elite that was trying to craft a very special republic. The French tried to do this in a direct democracy legislature, essentially. They tried to work with the mob to come up with this design, and that failed. And I think that there was recognition of the differences in the populations. Jefferson and others said Americans have no idea of the economic poverty and desperation of the French people, and he was right. They had been in this for centuries, and that did bring up a lot of this, quite frankly, justified anger. In the United States, the people were relatively prosperous. They were not as prosperous because of the British trade policies, but in both countries, it was the economy and economic conditions that proved the trigger. And that's something I talk about in Rage in the Republic is that keep in mind, even though we were the first Enlightenment revolution, those writings occurred decades earlier. So it wasn't like these writings of Locke and others immediately spurred intellectuals to rebel. It was really the economic conditions, and in France, it collapsed. There's a great irony here, by the way, because the French crown saw the American Revolution as a way of sticking it in the eye of the British and regaining a global dominance from the British. And so they helped fund the American Revolution. That pushed the crown even deeper into debt. In many ways, their support for the American Revolution proved it was sort of the undoing of the monarchy, because not only did it add crippling debt, but also the American Revolution then inspired many in France to say, well, we can do that too.
I promised myself I'm going to do a podcast one day on why King Louis XV is the worst monarch in the history of Europe. But that's for another day. You mentioned, and I wrote this down because I'd never heard this before, this term. And I want to bring it up now because you alluded to economies. What is commerce republicanism and why did it merit mention in your book?
Well, part of that is a discussion of the role of economic theory and economic impacts on revolution. One of the things I talk about at great length is that this is the 250th anniversary, not just of our revolution, but it's the 250th anniversary of the publication of Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And the reason that's important is that the Wealth of Nations was not a major hit in Europe. It was here because the founders immediately recognized that he had come up with an economic theory that was the perfect companion for their political theory, that you cannot be truly free unless you are economically free. And so I so the framers embraced capitalism as the natural companion to their Enlightenment revolution. It was the combination of capitalism and the Enlightenment principles that produced this model of democracy and of a republic in the United States. And the book talks about how capitalism is very much under attack, and there's a rise of support of socialism, even communism, among young people. These are young people that have no memory or experience with the collapse of socialist systems in the 20th century. And I go into a lot of detail on that, of the danger of that. And the most critical thing that I see in preserving this republic is what I call preserving a liberty enhancing economy, because I do believe it's the combination of economic and political theories that led to this unique republic.
Do you care to define liberty for us since you spend a couple paragraphs talk about how hard it is to define?
Well, no, liberty is really about individuals being able to dictate the course of their own lives in the United States. That we have this idea that this is a country that you can find your own manifest destiny, that you are your greatest product, you are your greatest creation. Thomas Paine represented that. He came to this country as an utter failure. He had to be carried off the ship. He almost died at sea. And yet he rose anew as a new Thomas Paine, even added an E at the end of his name that he didn't have before. He reinvented himself like many who come to these shores desire to do. And so liberty means that freedom of choice in your own life. And a liberty enhancing economy means an economy that allows people to pursue that manifest destiny. And one of the things I warn about is I take the most conservative views of the impact of robotics and AI, and even taking the most conservative studies. We're talking about a massive loss of jobs. And I do believe capitalism will adjust. But we are talking about a population of unemployed and potentially unemployable people in this country. And the expectation is that they would be given a living wage, that they would be on
Mhm.
a subsidy. And one of the things I talk about in the book is you cannot have a kept citizenry in this republic because it changes the relationship of a citizen to the state. You can't have the necessary independence in our republic if you have a kept citizenry. And also, it changes people's view of themselves. You know, we cannot be an arts and crafts citizenry, right? We can't just be someone that the government entertains us with for the rest of our life. People need to be able to seek their own expression, their own destiny. And so the book looks at how we can achieve that in the years to come.
One of the first things that I let me say it a different way. One of the things I remember, you take classes in college or whatever, and there are certain things that stick out. I got a C and a C plus in microeconomics. So no scholar there, even though it is the dismal science. So I'll exculpate myself for just a second. But I do remember opportunity cost and its implications throughout your life in fields beyond economics. And in political science, I was a history and political science double major. One of the very first things that I learned, which I had never heard before, was the freedom security trade off. More freedom you have, less security. More security, less freedom. How does that factor in? Because I think that's obviously manifestly logically true. How does that factor in the trade offs between using rage and the mob to get what you want but then you don't have much security afterward, especially with the national razor being erected in every city and town in France. You mentioned universal income. Very happy to see Richard Nixon's name in your book, as we're big
Yes.
Nixon fans here at the Leaders and Legends podcast. The freedom to spend what you want, do what you want because you've got the security of money. But you know what? You don't have a lot of, so now you have more freedom to do as you please, to take risks. How does all that factor into these theories, this time period?
Well, in the United States, we have a republic based on the idea that we have to sort of funnel the passions of politics, to control those passions, to protect minority interests. But we also have a strong view that, in terms of these underlying rights, I have a chapter entitled Why Big Fierce Rights Are Rare. And I refer back to a book I read at the University of Chicago, which was a rage at the time, called Why Are Big Fierce Animals Rare? It was a very interesting book about the biology and evolution of species. And the book tries to explain why big fierce animals are less numerous than smaller animals. And one of the arguments is that they require much more in terms of calories and consumption, and so there are fewer of them. The same is true with big fierce rights, is that they consume a lot of calories in a political system, particularly free speech. And a lot of people get tired of that, and that's one of the reasons why free speech is often the first right that is attacked during ages of rage. But in the United States, we have a much more robust view of those rights. And one of the things I argue in Rage in the Republic is that those rights are under attack, as well as the Constitution itself. We have many people, including the dean of Berkeley Law and other professors, saying the Constitution is a failure. Others are arguing that free speech is a danger. And what Rage in the Republic argues is that those are the things that actually got us here today as the most successful and stable democracy in history. That yes, they consume a lot of calories, but we need those rights, and we'll need them more than ever in the coming years because we are seeing a consolidation of power in global governance systems like the EU, also what I call corporate feudalism, with corporations controlling critical avenues for speech. It's very important that we not just remember these core rights, but double down on why they have to be preserved.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends. We're discussing Rage in the Republic, the unfinished story of the American Revolution, with its author, Jonathan Turley, reading your book and A Republic, if you can keep it, Franklin's famous admonition after the Constitutional Convention reminds me of the title of Mitch Daniels' superb book, To Keep a Republic, in which he lays out so much of his fascinating and very, very smart political philosophy and sort of experiences. Right after you mentioned free speech, I looked down at my notes, and the very next thing I had to ask you about is this. And I'll put it this way, and you can push back or maybe agree. Elon Musk buying Twitter is the single most important free speech moment in the last 100 years.
Yes, I agree entirely. In fact, in Rage and Republic, I talk about Musk because I do believe that his ultimate legacy may be found in free speech. The purchase of Twitter, the release of the Twitter files, allowed many of us who had spent years banging our head on the wall in Congress and testifying about the growing censorship system. It gave us concrete evidence of a state supported massive censorship system. It exposed that censorship, efforts to curtail even jokes online. It showed how there is this insatiable appetite that develops for censorship. Musk changed everything. As an advocate for free speech my whole life, I must tell you, as I said this in my earlier book, free speech was on the ropes. I mean, we were losing across the board. Europe, free speech is still in a free fall, and it was not going well. And that all changed when Musk bought Twitter. and release the Twitter files. And so you cannot underestimate his impact on that.
I love his response and I forget the guy who says Elon Musk should buy Twitter, and his response was, "How much is it?" Like he was talking about a refrigerator. Uh, why do we not just? I'll just stay focused on the United States, focused on Americans. Why do we? Why do we tend to embrace, or at least not oppose, demagogues? And do you have? I hate to ask you if you have a favorite one or two demagogues, but do you have one or two demagogues in your mind? You mentioned Huey Long in your book. Others. Why are we so fascinated by them?
Well, I think that the fascination with people like Huey Long is that they were able to harness rage in a way that others could not. And he was a demagogue. You know, his tactics were often untoward and illegal. And he openly discussed that. I mean, what was really fascinating about Huey Long is he admitted that he was doing all these things that he was sort of unapologetic about it. And there was something disarming about that level of honesty, and it's sort of like Governor Edwards and his honesty about corruption in Louisiana. You know, it's you would think what a scoundrel, but then you would sort of smile that he could be so open about being a scoundrel. I think we're fascinated because these are people who give license to our rage, and they are dangerous. And we're seeing that today. I've been highly critical of rhetoric on both sides of our politics today. But all of this talk, we just had another attempted assassination thwarted of the OMB director. And when they arrested this individual, he said, well, yeah, according to reports at least, I was trying to stop the fascist state. So he was just mimicking everything he's hearing about democracy's dying. This is fascism. They're Nazis. One of the typical methods used from the Jacobins to the Russians, communist on, is to dehumanize the people on the other side, to make it easier for people to take extreme measures because they're no longer truly human. So you can hit them with your car, or you can assassinate them because they're just a thing called fascists. They're not people. They're sort of like killing, the Empire's soldiers in Star Wars. You know, they're conveniently helmeted, so you don't even have to look at their face. That's part of releasing rage. You have to dehumanize everyone else. And that is something that is quite dangerous because what this book talks about is it happens very, very quickly. And I go into depth about people like Robespierre and some of his earliest speeches about how we have to protect due process and the rights of man. And then this is the same person who later said that terror is virtue and supported the execution of anyone who spoke against him or the revolution. It corrupts that once you lead the mob, either you continue to lead it to extremes or you are devoured by it.
Would you have signed Robespierre's death warrant?
Yes. Yes, and Marat as well, and, I actually am not a big supporter of the death penalty, but if anyone warranted it, yeah, I think Marat particularly was just an absolutely horrible person, but they were all, in the end, truly frightening individuals, and, it is interesting as I go into the book, Marat was assassinated by a wonderful figure, this young, beautiful woman named Corday. And Corday was, in fact, a Republican. She had supported the revolution, but she was watching Marat, particularly, order thousands to be executed. And she decided to kill him. And it led, by the way, to the beautiful picture by David of the death of Marat. And David was a radical Jacobin. And so he portrays Marat in this bathtub in almost a pietà with alabaster skin, even though he was in the bathtub because his body was covered in open sores because of a rare skin condition. And I think that ultimately, when Corday was executed, it was a turning point. Robespierre and Danton watched as she was brought to the place of execution, and uh, it was unlike other executions. The mob became very silent because she was so brave and courageous, and even when they cut her head off, I one of the executioners held the head up and slapped her face, and people suggested that the face responded, that it blushed, which the book, by the way, talks about as
Right.
this has been studied by medical scientists who believe that that may be true. That in fact, what they were witnessing was a reaction to the slap in the seconds after an execution. But it was a turning point for many. And of course, within a year, both of those individuals would be executed themselves.
We were discussing demagogues, and is there a difference between cult of personality, which is what I would put President Trump, I would put him in that silo, as opposed to a demagogue? And is it just easy to score cheap political points on television or on social media by, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, throwing around these insults, these accusations, these categorizations?
Yeah, I think that with a demagogue, you have to keep in mind that it's very contextual, that a demagogue is only a demagogue to the extent that you allow the person to be a demagogue. That is, a demagogue is usually someone with the power to wield on this. Our system is still functioning. That the president has lost cases in court. The court system has agreed with him on some things and has not agreed with him on others. Congress has allowed some stuff and not others. The system is actually working. And so, no, I don't think he's a demagogue in the true sense of someone who's wielding power without checks and balances. And by the way, both sides are engaging in reckless rhetoric. The same way as you have Chuck Schumer and others just ratcheting up this rhetoric, calling their opponents Nazis and Gestapo and fascists and democracy is going to die, which is completely ridiculous. The Madisonian system has survived for centuries. More importantly, it survived us. And
Yep.
that's what the book is trying to warn about. That is, the new Jacobins, as I call them, are law professors and pundits who are trying to eliminate not just the Constitution, and some have openly called for that, but the parts of the Constitution which brought us the stability to survive these periods. If they succeed, we will have a demagogue. We will have democratic despotism. And that's what people need to understand.
Is there a person, academic or media member, however you want to put it? Is there someone today who you enjoy reading, or more than one person whom you enjoy reading, and at the end you're like, I just don't understand how he or she can think that. Damn, it
No,
sure is a compelling argument just because I don't agree with it.
no, I love having a diversity of opinions. One of the things I talk about in this book and the last book was I loved my time at University of Chicago and meeting people who could see things and see something completely different. I was able to listen to Trotskyites and militant vegans and libertarians, and I loved every minute of it. We've lost that in higher education. There's simply less diversity, certainly among the faculty, which is almost entirely runs from the left to the far left. But I love it. And so I love deep thinkers, regardless if I disagree with them. Everyone from George Will to Mark Levin to others, because these are people who care deeply about their country and they have read profoundly and written profoundly about it. You can disagree with them without labeling them and trying to dehumanize them. And so I enjoy reading a lot of these figures, even if occasionally we disagree.
My favorite was, and I wish he was still around today, Christopher Hitchens.
Oh, yes.
You just
Yeah.
never knew what the hell he was gonna say and which side an issue he was gonna come on, but he was almost always like Andrew Sullivan, another favorite of mine.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh, they come down on the side of liberty, free press, freedom of speech, and, your points about freedom of speech being curtailed under siege, to me, is the single biggest threat to our democracy. It isn't that we have too many voices, it's that we have too few. And when people say freedom of speech needs to be curtailed, it's dangerous. To me, what they're really saying is the freedom of the speech of the people with whom I disagree is dangerous and needs to be curtailed.
No, I think that's absolutely correct.
We have just a few more minutes with Jonathan Turley. He's the author of Rage and the Republic, The Unfinished Story of the American Revolution. You mentioned two people and you connected them, and I just finished recording a podcast about a terrific book, and it's called The Last Adieu, and it's by Ryan Cole, who's here in Indiana, who's your author, and it's about Lafayette's final visit to the United States.
Yes.
You would enjoy it, Professor Turley, very much. It's a terrific book, wonderfully written. How does someone like Lafayette perhaps personify these revolutions? And how does
Well,
someone like Paine perhaps personify these revolutions?
well, it's fun. I talk about Lafayette a great deal in Rage and the Republic, as he with Paine are the two of the primary figures that played a role in both revolutions. And they both ultimately came close to being executed in France. Paine was saved by a complete happenstance. He was supposed to be executed in at the Luxembourg prison. They would just write the number of prisoners in the cell that would be taken out to be executed, and they did that night. There were four of them,
Mhm.
Paine and three Belgians. But the Belgians were trying to make him more comfortable, asked the jailer to open the door to get some air because Payne was very sick. When they opened the door, it pushed the chalk marking against the wall. So when they came to collect people, they didn't see it. Otherwise, Thomas Paine would have been executed. Lafayette also avoided execution, and he continually came back to France to try to save this country. And I do talk about that final trip to the United States. I but I also talk about his death, that when Lafayette died, and he was one of the few to survive
Mhm.
the French Revolution. It's a remarkable accomplishment. I But when he died, his son scattered soil from Bunker Hill over his grave in France, and his son's name was George Washington Lafayette. And Lafayette, like Paine, they viewed the United States as sort of their thumping heart. That's where they achieved so much. And it was such a beautiful moment that he would be buried under the soil of Bunker Hill.
And part of his visit to the United States was to be at Bunker Hill when they laid the cornerstone for the monument that's currently there on its 50th anniversary of the
That's
battle. June 1775, he made it. It was one of his last stops. It's easy. Last question. It's not easy, perhaps, but I mean, it's a daunting task requiring research and logic and discernment to talk about all the things that have gone wrong, are going wrong, could still go wrong. You, as a historian, and I'm going to say that as a compliment because I know you are a law professor, but as a historian, how important is it to you to get beyond sort of cataloging the ills and saying, but if we want to make it better, if we want to keep the republic, these are the things we have to do, we need to do.
Well, it's very important to me. And the second half of the book tries to offer a guide of survival in some sense for the American democracy, of what got us here and what we will need to get us through this century. And first and foremost, we are going to have to answer that question from that Frenchman. What then is this American? What were we? What are we today? We have to know the answer to that if we are going to survive this century. Because the fact is that these are indeed revolutionary times, but we remain a revolutionary people.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Professor Jonathan Turley. He is the author of Rage and the Republic, the unfinished story of the American Revolution. The book has been described as a masterpiece, a moving account on the very essence of liberty that should be on the shelf of every American. Professor Turley, this is your second time on the podcast. You please know you have an open invitation. We enjoy talking to you. We love reading what you write, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Robert. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you again.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.